For this target, it's target 5-4, and it says I can set up a proportion box to solve ratio and proportion word problems. Our essential question is, how do I solve a ratio and proportion word problem? The first thing we need to do is fill in your vocabulary. So first of all, what is a ratio? Now remember, a ratio is, a ratio compares two quantities. Like I'm comparing dogs to cats, I'm comparing boys to girls. That's what a ratio is. What is equivalent? Well, equivalent just means equal. And finally, in this target, we're working with proportions. Now we know what a proportion is when we think of a graph and a table and an equation. In this unit, we are looking at a proportion as two equal ratios. Now remember, it's just part of a table. It's like taking a proportional table and taking one little section or one little piece out of that. And for example, maybe this is our ratio 1 to 2. That is the same or equivalent or equal to the ratio 5 to 10. Those are two equivalent ratios, so that is a proportion. Now today what we're going to work on is ratio word problems, and this can be difficult because of all the words, and you really have to pick out the information and be able to solve it. So what we're going to do is we're going to show you kind of an easy method to get started with solving ratio word problems, and then show you how to solve that and how to answer it. So the first thing you have to do is read the problem. So last weekend, Will helped his father clean the garage. For every 3 hours of work, he took a 2-hour break. If he worked for 6 hours, not including breaks, how many hours did he spend taking breaks? Well, the first thing you need to do is figure out what type of problem this is. This is a ratio problem because they're giving us information about 3 hours of work and 2 hours on break. So that is a ratio because it compares two quantities, 3 hours of work to 2 hours on break. So the first thing we want to do is underline that important information in that ratio statement. So we're going to underline 3 hours of work and 2 hours on break. Those two numbers are the numbers that are being compared to each other. They go together. The question says if he worked for 6 hours, how many hours did he spend taking breaks? Well, we're going to follow this problem-solving process, and the very first thing that we just did is underline the ratio statement in the word problem because we're comparing two things. This is a ratio problem. Now, we're given three numbers and there's a missing number. We want to know how many hours he spent taking breaks. And so what this tells us is that it's going to be a proportion. If you think of two equal ratios, we have four numbers. And so what we're given is three numbers, we're missing one. So that gives us an idea that we need to set up this thing called a proportion box. A proportion box is just a really nice way to set up a ratio word problem. So the first thing we want to do when we set up a proportion box is we need labels. And we've been working on that with ratios. What two things are you comparing? But specifically, what are the words? So if you go back to your ratio statement, that's one of the reasons why we underlined it. We're comparing hours of work to hours on break. So we're going to write that down. Hours of work to hours on break. This is an extremely important part to setting up these word problems. So you cannot skip this. You have to label it. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to write the ratio of work to break. And again, that's why we underlined the ratio statement. The ratio statement says we have 3 hours of work and 2 hours on break. So that tells us that the 3 is going to go next to the label of work because the 3 hours of work, it goes together. The 2 is going to go with hours on break because going back to the ratio statement, it says 2-hour break. So those numbers and those words should match up. Next, it says if he worked for 6 hours, how many hours did he spend taking breaks? Notice how I'm underlining that key information. That's really going to help you when you're solving these word problems. So again, if you look at, think of this as a table. That's really all it is. it says he worked for 6 hours. Well, I just have to look at where my label for work is, and that's where my 6 has to go. If he works for 6 hours, I don't know how many hours that he spent on break. So this is my number that I don't know. I need to figure out what that number is. Now you guys have already worked with this. You've filled in equivalent ratios on a table before this learning target. So that's really all you're doing. So what we could do, now that we've set up our proportion box and we know what we're looking for and we have our labels, now step 3 is figure out the missing value of x. Well, this is really what our proportion box did. We have the ratio 3:2. We know that that is equivalent or equal to this ratio, 6 over, we don't know what that number is. So a lot of times in math, when we don't know what a number is, we give it a variable, a letter, right? So now we need to look at how do I figure out what x is. Well, this one's pretty easy because a lot of you are probably already noticing that 3 times 2 gives me 6. So I'm going to do the same thing with that denominator, 2 times 2. And then you can write down what x is. Well, 2 times 2 is 4. Okay, so that is the value of x. And that should make sense. You should always go back to look at your answer and see if it makes sense. Since our hours of work really just doubled, okay, so times 2, that should also happen with the hours that you spent on break. The hours on break are also going to double. So that should make sense to you. If I got an answer of 100 hours on break, that makes no sense. So please make sure your answer makes sense to you. The last thing we're going to look at is that that you write your answer as a complete sentence. This causes you to slow down, go back to the question, and make sure that you're answering it. The question said, if he worked for 6 hours, how many hours did he spend taking breaks? Well, I know my answer is 4, but I want to know, well, what does that mean? What does it represent? Well, it represents the number of hours he spent on break, and it's easy to see because the word is break, and that's where my missing number was. So I know it's 4 hours on break. So let's use a complete sentence and say, Will spent 4 hours on break. Period. But you have to write a complete sentence. Do not just write 4. And you also want to make sure you're going back and you are answering what they've asked you to answer. Okay? So now we're going to go to the next one. Again, let's follow those same problem-solving steps. So number 1 is read the question. The ratio of the number of girls to the total number of students in Miss Teasdale's class is 2 to 5. The number of girls in her class is 12. How many total students are in the class? Well, first of all, we know this is a ratio problem because it tells us the ratio. And then we want to underline what 2 things we're comparing, okay, with the labels. So the ratio of number of girls to the total number of students is 2 to 5. That tells us what our labels are going to be. So the number of girls to the total number of students, and also we realize that is a part to whole ratio. So our labels are going to be girls and total students. The next thing we need is the numbers in the proportion box. Well, it says the number of girls to the total number of students is 2 to 5. Well, if number of girls came first, then the first number 2 is going to correspond with girls. Total number of students came second in the sentence, and so the second number 5 has to go with the total students. The question, it says the number of girls in her, the number of girls in her class is 12. The question says how many total students are in the class. We know the girls is 12, and we want to know how many total students are in the class. Again, that tells us that the number of girls is 12, so I look at my label, girls is on the top, so I have to put the 12 on the top. Total students is on the bottom, and that's what the question is asking. How many total students are in class? That is the number I don't know. So that's my x. Now that we've set up our proportion box, we need to find out what x is. So you take your information from the proportion box and let's set it up like this and find out what x is. Now again, it's probably easy to see the relationship as we move from side to side. 2 times what is 12? Well, 2 times 6 is 12. So we're going to do the same thing in the denominator. 5 times 6 is what? Well, 5 times 6 is just 30. So x is 30. Now again, we need to go back, make sure our answer makes sense, and that we've answered the question. How many total students are in the class? Well, our answer is 30, and we need to write a complete sentence. There are 30 students in the class. And again, we want to make sure that makes sense. Obviously, the total students is going to be bigger than the number of girls, and there are 12 girls, and so 30 probably makes sense. Here's our next question. The ratio of red paint to yellow paint is 3 to 4. We're going to underline that ratio statement. It's a ratio problem. If I use 18 gallons of red paint, how many gallons of yellow paint will I need? So I underlined the ratio statement, and now I need to label my proportion box. So if I go back to the ratio statement, I am comparing red paint to yellow paint. The ratio they give me is 3 to 4, and I know that red came first, and so the first number is 3, so that has to go with red. The second number is 4, and the second word is yellow, so I know that the 3 goes with red, the 4 goes with yellow. The rest of the information says if I use 18 gallons of red paint, so I know that 18 goes with red. How many gallons of yellow paint will I need? That's what I'm looking for. So now you have your proportion box set up. Now we need to figure out what the missing value of x is. So we're going to put 3 over 4 equals 18 over x. Again, you can probably see that 3 times what is 18, and these are equivalent, so it has to be the same number. 3 times 6 is 18. So now down in the denominator, you have to do 4 times 6. Well, 4 times 6 is 24. So again, let's go back to the question. How many gallons of yellow paint will I need? Our answer is 18, but we're going to write a complete sentence. I will need 18 gallons of yellow paint. Oops, and it's not 18, it's 24. Good thing I looked back at my answer. Okay, so I will need 24 gallons of yellow paint. Again, I know it's yellow because X is here, and that's the label that I'm using to find X. Now you try this next one. In your music class, the ratio of boys to girls is 6 to 5. If there are 24 boys in the class, how many girls are in the class? Notice the proportion box isn't given to you, so you have to set up your own proportion box, write in your labels, set it up, and follow the problem-solving process that you used in previous problems.